Inspire, expire. Imagine yourself lying on a Victorian armchair. The lamplight is dim. The smell of ether and mould fills the air. You are not in a hospital. You are in the living room of a physician's surgeon. Today, you have come to treat something simple, a headache. But for the Victorians, the remedy was always the same: bleed until you get better. The practice of bloodletting comes from antiquity, but it was in the Victorian era that it reached its peak. The concept was simple and frightening. The human body is a vessel of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Diseases? Imbalance of these fluids. Headache? Too much blood. Fever? Too much blood. Cough, melancholy, even tuberculosis? Too much blood. The solution? Remove blood, always. In the humblest homes, the crude method was used. Incisions in the skin with a scalpel or razor until porcelain bowls were filled with warm blood. But in high society, there was a more elegant alternative. Leeches. Small creatures applied to the arms, back, even the face. They attached themselves to the skin and slowly sucked. The process could last for hours, and it was considered less aggressive, more scientific. The curious thing? Leeches were so popular that the trade imported millions of them annually. The problem? The sick body was already weak, and excessive bleeding led to dehydration, anemia, collapses, and often death. Victorian doctors believed that if the patient fainted, it was a good sign. The impure blood has been expelled. Balance has returned. Unfortunately, for many, that fainting spell was the last. The end of the 19th century brought a revolution. The germ theory. With Pasteur and Lister, it became clear that infections came from invisible microbes, not from mystical imbalances. Bloodletting fell into disuse, but not without resistance. Many doctors were reluctant to abandon centuries-old practices. It may seem absurd, but even today, similar practices persist. Alternative therapies that talk about blood detoxification, treatments that promise to cleanse the body through cupping, modern bloodletting, or even extreme diets. The obsession with purifying the body still lives on, in another way, with another name, but the idea is the same. If something is wrong, it must be removed from your body, while the sounds of the forest in the background whisper serenely. Think about this. How many of today's miracle cures will be seen as barbarities in the future? Time judges everything, and so the blood spilled in the Victorian era still tells its story, dripping drop by drop in our memory. Take a deep breath, and let's continue our journey. Close your eyes. Feel the metallic scent of the tonic in your hands. They say it's the cure for all ills. Weakness, anxiety, even syphilis. But what you don't know is that you are holding pure arsenic. If in the Victorian era you were looking for an effective remedy, poison was part of the recipe. Literally, arsenic, highly toxic, fatal in small doses. But in the 19th century, it was found in tonics, beauty pills, and even in sweet children's medicines. The reason? The belief that in small quantities, the poison stimulated the body. Women took arsenic to have porcelain white skin. Men used it to strengthen their nerves. Cruel irony. The side effects included nausea, hair loss, black spots on the skin, and organ failure. Another darling of Victorian medicine was mercury. If today we know how neurotoxic it is, At that time, it was the basis of ointments, pills, and mouthwashes. Syphilis, treated with mercury compounds. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. So went the proverb of the time. Patients spent months inhaling vapors or applying mercury creams, unaware that they were slowly poisoning themselves. Tremors, excessive salivation, delusions, and eventually, death. In the final years of the Victorian era, the fascination with science brought a new poison to the scene: radium. Newly discovered, the radioactive element seemed miraculous. It glowed in the dark. It emitted heat. Soon it was incorporated into toothpaste, face creams, and even energy drinks. The marketing promised vitality, rejuvenation, cure. The result? Bone fractures, necrosis of the jaw, cancer. But the radioactive aesthetic was so fascinating that, for decades, the dangers were ignored. The most disturbing thing is that, for Victorian doctors, the dose was the distinction between cure and murder. Unaware of the cumulative effects, they sincerely believed that small quantities were safe. But each spoonful of arsenic, each application of mercury, was a silent Russian roulette. Today, the idea of ingesting poison seems absurd. But is it really? Modern treatments, like chemotherapy, although based on solid science, still face similar dilemmas: destroying diseased cells without killing the host. And cosmetic products with questionable substances, they are still on the shelves. The fascination with quick solutions, regardless of the hidden cost, continues to haunt us. Remember, the brilliance of science can blind, and in the Victorian era, that blindness cost lives. Take a deep breath, let the dust of the 19th century settle, and let's move forward to the next chapter of this night. Imagine yourself walking down a Victorian street. The ground is damp, the stones uneven. A dense fog covers everything with a yellowish veil. It's not the poetic mist of a Gothic novel. It's pure pollution. Smoke from chimneys, horse excrement, industrial fumes. Progress was the pride of the Victorian era. But in the streets, it had a fetid smell. The 19th century was an era of great innovations. Factories, locomotives, public lighting, but it was also the era of soot. The streets of London, Manchester, and Birmingham were covered by a black layer of burned coal. Children played in dark alleys, inhaling toxic particles. Adults coughed incessantly. The London fog was so common that it became part of the city's soundscape. With each breath, a little more lung was sacrificed. Before the construction of modern sewage systems, Victorian streets were literally bathed in waste. The so-called night soil men emptied cesspools manually, but they couldn't always keep up. On hot days, the smell was unbearable. In 1858, the odour reached such a point that it became known as the Great Stink. Parliament was forced to suspend its activities, not out of principle, but because they couldn't stand the smell. The consequence? Epidemics of cholera, typhoid, dysentery. With open sewers and accumulated garbage, the streets were a paradise for rats, cockroaches, and insects. Rats transmitted diseases. Fleas spread typhus. Flies contaminated food. Still, at the height of industrial arrogance, the authorities ignored the pests. After all, progress could not be interrupted by such small details. But death walked side by side with every passing cart. When gas first illuminated the streets, it was seen as a triumph of modernity. However, gas lamps released carbon monoxide and other toxins. In homes and streets, the air became denser, and deaths from silent asphyxiation multiplied. The irony was cruel. What illuminated the Victorian nights also darkened the lungs of its inhabitants. Victorian streets were not only dirty, they were also a mirror of inequality. In wealthy neighbourhoods, gentlemen dodged the sewers with elegant canes. In working-class neighbourhoods, barefoot children played in the contaminated mud. The contrast was stark. Progress served the privileged few, while the majority sank literally into the filth. Today, the streets of big cities seem clean, but air pollution, poorly managed waste, and social inequalities still echo from the Victorian alleys. The fetish for progress at any cost has not disappeared. It has only changed shape, and if we look closely, we will see that the soot of that time still haunts our lungs. Imagine the Victorian streets dissolving into the fog. The past, although distant, remains present in the shadows of modernity. Take a deep breath, let the dust settle, and prepare yourself. Our next step will be even more disturbing. Imagine yourself in a Victorian doctor's office. The room is dark, lit only by candlelight. The air smells of alcohol, blood, and old dust. The doctor wears a stained lab coat. On the shelf, glass jars with colourful and suspicious liquids. Here, medicine is not science. It is a mixture of tradition, superstition, and brutal experiments. Prepare to enter a world where the cure was often worse than the disease. Before anesthesia became widespread, surgeries were performed by brute force. Patients were tied down. Assistants held arms and legs, and the scalpel did its work without mercy. The success of a surgery was measured by the surgeon's speed. The faster, the lower the chance of the patient dying of shock. The pain was inevitable, and, for many, fatal. Diseases like syphilis, tuberculosis, and even simple wounds were treated with mercury compounds. Yes, the same mercury that we now know to be highly toxic. Arsenic was also popular, present in tonics, creams, and even medicinal candies. The side effects? Paralysis, kidney failure, dementia. But in the Victorian view, if the patient suffered, it was a sign that the treatment was working. There was an obsession with cleansing the body from within. Potent laxatives, emetics, vomit inducers, and bloodlettings were prescribed for practically everything. It was believed that eliminating impure fluids would help restore the balance of humours. Weakened, dehydrated, and anemic patients were seen as in the process of healing. Cruel irony. The treatment undermined the body's last reserves of strength. When chloroform was introduced as an anaesthetic, it was hailed as a revolution. But without knowledge of the correct dosages, many patients simply did not wake up after surgeries. It was a chemical Russian roulette. The same substance that would bring pain relief could be their last breath. Mental disorders were treated with violent methods. Electric shocks, prolonged ice baths, and even rotations in spinning chairs to reorganize brain fluids. The consequences? Irreversible physical and psychological trauma. But in the eyes of Victorian medicine, suffering was a necessary step towards normalization. There were also natural remedies with exotic touches. Donkey milk was indicated for respiratory problems. Raw liver extracts for anemia. Opium for fussy babies. Danger lurked in every spoonful. But the lack of regulation allowed any mixture to be sold as a miracle solution. In the Victorian era, getting sick was dangerous, but being cured could be even more lethal. Each visit to the doctor was a roulette of archaic methods, poorly understood experiments, and negligence disguised as science. Medicine was, in many cases, just a formality before death. Curiously, many of the concepts of that time still resonate today. The obsession with quick cures, the cult of miraculous solutions, the blind faith in pseudo-scientific fads. Victorian medicine serves as a warning. Progress without understanding is just a new form of darkness. Take a deep breath. Feel the relief of living in another era. But remember, ignorance also evolves. In the Victorian era, death was omnipresent. Diseases, complicated childbirths, commonplace accidents. Losing loved ones was an inevitable part of life. But the Victorians did not limit themselves to silent mourning. They transformed death into a ritual, into a business, into a lifestyle. Each tear, each wearing of black, each withered flower, everything carefully planned. Today, we will unravel how death was commercialized and became part of the Victorian identity. There were entire manuals dedicated to the etiquette of mourning. The closer the deceased, the stricter the rules. Widows were to wear absolute black for at least 2 years. Jewellery? Only jet, a polished black fossil, a symbol of grief. Attending social events? Unthinkable. Even the tone of voice, posture and gaze should convey constant sadness. Mourning was a social performance. It was not enough to suffer, it was necessary to suffer correctly. With the popularization of photography, a morbid trend emerged. Post-mortem portraits, photographing the deceased, carefully positioned, as if they were merely sleeping. Dead babies were placed in their mothers' laps. Adults, supported by invisible stands, simulated life. For many families, that would be the only photograph of their loved one. It was a ritual of denial, but also of eternalization, a way to defy death, even if just for a moment. Victorian funerals were not simple farewells. They were true social spectacles. Luxurious carriages, long processions with dozens of extras, flowers, music, even advertisements in newspapers. The larger and more expensive the funeral, the more respect the family gained. There was an entire industry dedicated to the death show, from manufacturers of luxury coffins to suppliers of personalized wreaths and veils. Dying was, literally, an investment. Many residences had the so-called mourning room, a room reserved for wakes and funeral visits. With heavy curtains, dark furniture, and portraits of ancestors, mourning was lived at home. The coffin remained on display for days, while friends and family came to offer their condolences. Daily life stopped. Death settled at the centre of domestic life. The pain of loss, combined with the fascination with the afterlife, made spiritualism a cultural phenomenon. Seances became common. Turning tables, automatic writing, spirit photographs. It was a desperate attempt to maintain contact with those who had already departed. Death, for the Victorians, was not an absolute end. It was just another room in the house, darker, quieter. Beyond clothing, there was the practice of creating jewellery with the hair of the deceased. Bracelets, brooches and necklaces made of braided strands, carrying the physical memory of the loved one, pocket watches with funerary inscriptions, medallions with miniatures of post-mortem portraits. Time and death intertwined, creating amulets of loss objects that weighed on the soul and on the chest. Today, our relationship with death is distant. Hospitals, funeral homes, quick cremations. But Victorian culture reminds us of something primordial. Death was faced head-on, assumed, ritualized, integrated into daily life. Was it exaggerated? Yes. But also deeply human. Pain, mourning, and remembrance were treated with a respect that today seems almost lost. Perhaps, in the excess, there was a wisdom. After all, denying death does not protect us from it. It only distances us from understanding our own finiteness. Death always accompanies us, but it is up to us to decide. Will we ignore it or learn from its silence? In the Victorian era, the concept of mental health was brutally simplified. Precise diagnoses did not exist. It was enough to be different, inconvenient, or too emotional. The solution? Hiding the undesirables in enormous mental asylums, true prisons of the mind. Today, we will open the doors of these forgotten places and understand how Victorian society treated those who most needed compassion. The lunatic asylums were immense constructions. Imposing facades, walled courtyards, endless corridors. But don't be fooled by the architecture. Inside, the goal was not cure, it was confinement. Women considered hysterical, men with war traumas, people with epilepsy, or even insubordinate wives. Any deviation from acceptable behaviour was grounds for seclusion. It was easier to hide the problem than to face it. The methods applied in Victorian asylums would today be classified as institutionalized torture, forced ice baths, straitjackets for days, isolation in dark cells, application of leeches to balance the humours, induction of seizures with chemicals, all under the justification of calming the nerves. In practice, it was a method to silence the unwanted. For many, entering an asylum was a life sentence. Records show patients forgotten for decades. Without visits, without hope, overcrowding was chronic. People crammed into communal beds, sharing space with rats and diseases. The mortality rate was extremely high. But since the dead did not return to bother anyone, no one outside the walls seemed to care. Despite the grim scenario, a few doctors and nurses sought more humane treatments. Movements like moral treatment emerged, proposing outdoor activities, encouragement of reading, and social interaction. It was a timid beginning, but still a breath of dignity amidst despair. Unfortunately, they were exceptions in a system that preferred neglect. The legacy of these asylums is profound. The image of madness as something to be feared, isolated, silenced, comes in large part from that time. Even today, traces of this stigma remain. Our discomfort in dealing with mental illness is a direct echo of the Victorian cells. The difference? Today the walls are invisible, but they remain standing. Victorian asylums did not only imprison bodies, they taught us to fear human fragility, and perhaps it is time to break these chains. For much of the Victorian era, disease had a simple explanation: bad air. Thick fogs, the stench of sewage, the foul breath of overcrowded cities. This was the dreaded miasma. Doctors, scholars, and politicians believed that these noxious vapors were the root cause of illnesses like cholera, tuberculosis, and typhoid. Clean air was health, foul air was death. It seemed logical. After all, epidemics struck hardest in filthy, smog-choked neighbourhoods. But they were wrong. The world before germs. Victorian medicine was built on centuries-old ideas of humours and miasmas. Sanitation was seen as a matter of morality and aesthetics, not science. Diseases floated in the air, they thought, seeping into bodies through invisible vapours. This belief shaped entire cities. Wide boulevards were built to clear the air, and sweet-smelling flowers or vinegar were used as protective charms. Enter the microbe. In the mid-19th century, a quiet revolution began in laboratories. Louis Pasteur, a French chemist, observed that microorganisms spoiled wine and milk. His experiments shattered the miasma theory, proving that tiny, invisible life forms, germs, were responsible for infections. Around the same time, Robert Koch identified specific bacteria causing diseases like anthrax and tuberculosis. His methods of staining and culturing bacteria allowed scientists to see for the first time the true culprits behind deadly epidemics. The world would never be the same. At first, the germ theory was met with skepticism, even ridicule. The idea that invisible creatures too small for the eye to see could bring down empires was culturally shocking. For many Victorians, disease was a punishment for vice, sin, or poverty. Accepting germs meant abandoning moralistic views of health. But as antiseptic techniques reduced infections in hospitals and vaccines saved lives, resistance crumbled. Miasma's last breath. One of the most famous battles between miasma and germ theory played out in London. Dr. John Snow traced a cholera outbreak, not to bad air, but to a contaminated water pump on Broad Street. His work laid the foundation for modern epidemiology and delivered a fatal blow to the miasma myth. Legacy of the germ revolution. The acceptance of germ theory transformed medicine. Hospitals adopted sterilization. Public health focused on clean water and sanitation. Vaccines became a powerful tool against disease. It marked the birth of modern microbiology, hygiene, and preventive medicine. But old beliefs die slowly. Even today, echoes of miasma linger. Terms like bad energy, toxins, and detox cures are the modern descendants of Victorian misconceptions. The germ theory revolution was not just a scientific triumph, it was a cultural upheaval that forced humanity to see the unseen and to confront the invisible enemies within us. Although Victorian medicine seems like an outdated chapter in history, its echoes still resonate today. Archaic practices such as bloodletting, miraculous tonics, and hospitals, more lethal than healing, taught humanity harsh lessons about science, hygiene, and public responsibility. The legacy of that era reminds us that progress is fragile and that ignorance, when disguised as tradition, can be deadly. Even now, in times of high technology, we are haunted by conspiracy theories, charlatanism disguised as natural cures, and the old fear of the invisible. The Victorian era has not died. It has only changed its face. Sleep well, and may your dreams be beautifully disturbing.